The doorbell rang at 7 on a chilly Saturday morning in March, and I knew exactly who was on the other side of the door. Two elders from the congregation, with their worn leather briefcases and that expression I learned to recognize over 42 years of dedicated service, the same expression they used when they came to investigate something, when they came to silence someone, when they came to cover up traces of inconvenient truths. My heart pounded, not from fear, but from a strange certainty that had been growing inside me for months, like a plant finally breaking through concrete. They were there because of the questions I asked at the last meeting, because of the documents I found hidden in the old filing cabinet in the Kingdom Hall, because of the conversation I had with that white-haired woman who showed up crying at my door 3 weeks ago, telling me things that made me question everything. 63 years of life, and I thought I knew every comma of that organization. I was baptized at 21, raised my daughter in the truth, lost my husband who refused a blood transfusion as we were taught was God's way, and spent decades knocking on thousands of doors through sun and rain, convinced I was saving lives. I was a regular pioneer for 17 years, helped clean the hall, participated in relief committees, visited the sick, comforted the bereaved, and defended the organization against all who criticized it. My entire life was built on that foundation, every brick laid with the absolute certainty that I was serving Jehovah. But that morning, with the two elders standing on my porch, I finally understood that I had spent over 4 decades living inside a carefully constructed illusion. What I discovered wasn't a small detail, wasn't an isolated human failing or an administrative error. What I found was an entire system of concealment, a well-oiled machine of silencing that had been operating for generations, protecting those who should have been questioned and destroying those who dared to ask. And the most frightening part? Everyone at the top knew. They always knew. The truth no one wanted to reveal wasn't hidden in some secret document locked away in New York, it was right there, in front of all of us, disguised as Christian love, as spiritual protection, as waiting on Jehovah. When I opened that door on that March morning, I had no idea I was about to lose everything, my community, my friends of decades, my own daughter who would stop speaking to me. But I also didn't know I was about to gain something far more precious, my own voice, my ability to think freely, and finally, after 63 years, my true freedom. This is the story of how I got there, and the secret that changed absolutely everything. My name is Dorothy Castellano, I am 63 years old, I live in Portland, Oregon, and for 42 years I was a completely dedicated Jehovah's Witness. Until I wasn't anymore. Before I continue, I want you to understand something important about this story. It is not a religious attack, it is not motivated by bitterness or revenge, and it is definitely not a lie fabricated by someone who was expelled for immoral conduct, as the organization will surely say if this reaches their ears. This is simply the naked truth of a woman who spent most of her life believing in something, only to discover that what she believed in was not exactly what it appeared to be. And if you are watching this account now, whether you are an active witness, someone who has doubts, a former member trying to process their trauma, or just a curious person trying to understand how the inner workings of a religious organization operate, I ask only one thing: listen with an open mind. I know this is a difficult time to click buttons on a video, but if this story is resonating with you in any way, if you feel that tightness in your chest that comes when someone is speaking truths you've always sensed but never managed to verbalize, do me a favor. Subscribe to this channel, like this video so more people can find this account, and even more importantly, leave a comment saying what city you are watching from. I want to know where the people are who, like me, are seeking honest answers. It doesn't matter if you are in Sao Paulo, Lisbon, Luanda, Maputo, or any other corner of the world where Portuguese is spoken. Leave your mark here, let me know that I am not alone on this journey of discovery. Over the next few minutes, I will share with you exactly what happened, from my childhood outside the organization to the moment I first knocked on that door, through the golden years when I truly believed I was on the right path, up until the day everything fell apart. I will talk about practices that happen inside the kingdom halls that outsiders never see, about policies that are rigidly followed but never publicly admitted, about what really happens when someone questions the leadership, and especially, about the specific secret I discovered, the one that cost me everything, but that also set me completely free. This story is going to be long, it's going to be detailed, and at times it's going to be hard to hear. But I promise that every word is true, every event I describe happened exactly as I am recounting it, and every feeling I share is genuine. So prepare yourself, because the journey I'm about to share is about discovering that sometimes, the truth we seek is hidden right under our noses, protected by layers of doctrine, fear, and social control that take decades to unravel. Let's start at the beginning, when I was a 20-year-old who had no idea what I was about to walk into. I had just turned 20 when two women rang the doorbell of the tiny apartment I shared with my coworker in Northeast Portland. It was 1982, and I was at a strange point in life. I had ended a troubled relationship a few months earlier, worked as a secretary in an accounting office that paid me little and valued me less, and felt that existential emptiness that many young adults feel when they realize life is not as simple as it seemed in adolescence. My parents were nominal Catholics, the kind who went to Mass at Christmas and Easter, so I had no solid religious background, just that vague notion that God existed somewhere distant, concerned with things too important to worry about 20-year-old girls working in boring offices. The two women at my door were different from any stereotypical Jehovah's Witness you might imagine. One of them was young, perhaps my age, with a genuine smile and no trace of that sales-pitch demeanor I would expect from someone doing religious proselytizing. The other was older, must have been in her early 40s, and had that peacefulness in her eyes that made you want to trust her immediately. They didn't start with Bible verses or with questions about whether I wanted to live forever in paradise. Instead, they asked if I had ever wondered why there was so much suffering in the world, why good people went through terrible things, why life seemed so unfair sometimes. And honestly, those questions hit something inside me that desperately needed to be touched. I invited them in, which in retrospect I realize was exactly what they hoped I would do. We spent 2 hours talking on that first visit, and they came back the next week, and the next, and the next. Within 6 months, I was attending meetings at the Kingdom Hall on Southeast Division Street, had started a regular Bible study with the older woman named Patricia, and was genuinely convinced that I had found something special. It wasn't just the theology that attracted me, although the answers they gave for complex issues seemed incredibly logical and well-founded in Scripture. It was the community, the sense of purpose, the idea that my life could mean something bigger than just working, paying bills, and waiting for eventual death. They offered me hope, identity, and belonging, 3 things I didn't know I was desperately searching for. My baptism took place at a district assembly at the Memorial Coliseum in the summer of 1983. I remember standing in line with 43 other people, most of them young like me, waiting to enter that portable pool while thousands of witnesses watched us from the stands. When I submerged in that water and came out the other side as a baptized Jehovah's Witness, I felt reborn, that my old life had been washed away and that I was starting completely from scratch. I had no idea that this baptism was not just a religious symbol, but also a legal contract that would bind me to the organization in ways I could not imagine. I didn't know that the questions I answered before being baptized, about accepting the organization as God's channel on earth and submitting to its authority, were not just statements of faith, but were commitments that could be used against me decades later. The first few years were genuinely wonderful, and I'm not saying that with retrospective sarcasm or cynicism. I made friendships that seemed deeper than anything I had experienced before, participated in activities that made me feel useful and important, and developed teaching and communication skills that I would never have developed in another context. I met my husband, Vincent, at a regional convention in Eugene 2 years after my baptism. He was a ministerial servant, worked as an electrician, had that kind of solid, unwavering faith that made me feel safe, as if as long as we were together following the organization, nothing truly bad could happen to us. We married in 1986 in a simple ceremony at the Kingdom Hall, with a 30-minute talk on the Christian responsibilities of marriage and a small reception where we served sandwiches and non-alcoholic punch. Our daughter, Sophia, was born 2 years later, and we immediately dedicated ourselves to raising her in the truth, determined to give her the spiritual guidance we thought would make her a better, happier person, more prepared for the new world that was surely coming soon. At that time, in the early 90s, there was still a lot of expectation that the end would come before the year 2000, that our daughter might not even need to attend high school because Armageddon would arrive before that. We built our entire lives around that expectation, that promise, that absolute certainty that we were among the chosen ones who would survive while the rest of the world would be destroyed. Becoming a regular pioneer in 1995 was one of the proudest moments of my life as a witness. Sophia was 7 and in school, Vincent worked full-time but fully supported me, and I finally had the time and energy to dedicate myself to the 90 monthly hours of preaching that pioneering required at the time. I woke up at 5:30 every morning, prepared breakfast for the family, took Sophia to school, and by 9 o'clock I was at the Kingdom Hall with my preaching group, ready to spend the day knocking on doors, making return visits, conducting Bible studies. It was physically exhausting, but spiritually I felt on top of the world, as if I was doing exactly what God had created me for. The other pioneer sisters were my best friends. We spent hours together every day, shared simple lunches between territories, prayed together when we encountered difficult people or challenging situations, and celebrated together when someone accepted a magazine or agreed to a study. But there were aspects of congregational life that subtly began to bother me, although I pushed those discomforts to the back of my mind whenever they arose. The way the elders treated certain divorced sisters with a mix of pity and suspicion, as if the end of their marriages was automatically a sign of spiritual failure. The way young people who asked intelligent questions about doctrines were quietly discouraged from being too curious, directed to simply trust the organization instead of seeking deeper answers. The way entire families were destroyed by the disfellowshipping policy, with parents being forced to cut off contact completely with adult children who had left, treating them as if they were dead. I rationalized all this, of course. I told myself that discipline was necessary, that Jehovah knew what he was doing, that it wasn't my place to question policies that came directly from the governing body in New York. There was an incident in 1998 that should have been a giant red flag, but which I managed to explain away in my head as an isolated situation. A teenager in the congregation, Julia, who was 15 and the daughter of a respected elder, approached me after a meeting in tears, asking to talk privately. We went to my car in the parking lot, and she told me, in a trembling voice that could barely form the words, that an older brother in the congregation, a married man in his mid-40s who had ministerial privileges, had sexually abused her over a period of several months when he offered to drive her home from meetings while her parents stayed longer handling cleaning assignments. My blood ran cold hearing that, and I immediately told her we needed to tell the elders, that this needed to be handled, that she would be protected and believed. But that's not what happened. When we took the case to the elders, they did exactly what their procedure manual instructed. They demanded there be 2 witnesses to the abuse before they could take any action against the accused brother. Obviously, there were no 2 witnesses to secret sexual abuse. Julia was subjected to multiple judicial committee meetings where she had to repeat the traumatic details of what happened to 3 older men who asked invasive questions about exactly what he did, how she reacted, why she didn't scream, why she kept accepting rides. The abuser denied everything, claimed the girl was having fantasies or trying to cause trouble, and without a second witness, the elders said they could do nothing but pray about the situation. Julia and her family ended up moving to another congregation months later, completely destroyed. The abuser continued to serve, continued to give talks, continued to be seen as an exemplary brother. I was devastated, but when I expressed my concerns to Vincent and other elders, I was gently reminded that it was not my place to question how Jehovah organized his congregations, and that we should trust that justice would eventually be done, if not now, then in the new world. It was around this time that Vincent started having health problems. First it was just persistent stomach aches that he ignored, then weight loss that we attributed to work stress, until finally, in 2003, after months of me begging him to go to the doctor, we discovered he had advanced stage colon cancer. The treatment would require aggressive chemotherapy and possibly surgery, but the doctor explained that during the process, Vincent would likely need blood transfusions due to the severe anemia the cancer was causing. I remember Vincent looking at me in that sterile doctor's office, and without saying a word, we both knew what had to happen. He would refuse the blood, because that was what Jehovah commanded, that was what the organization had taught for decades, that was what it meant to be faithful until death. The doctor looked at us as if we were insane, pleaded with us to reconsider, explained that Vincent was essentially choosing to die over an issue that modern medicine had made completely manageable. But we were firm, supported by the elders who visited regularly, by the brothers who prayed with us, by the absolute conviction that Jehovah would reward Vincent's faithfulness with a resurrection in paradise. Vincent died 6 months later, in March 2004, weighing just over 100 pounds, his body consumed by the disease that could have been successfully treated if he had accepted blood. He was 47. Sophia was 16 and was completely traumatized by losing her father that way. The congregation was incredibly supportive during the funeral and in the weeks immediately after, bringing food, offering practical help, ensuring we never felt alone. But as the months passed, life returned to normal for everyone except us. The visits dwindled, the offers of help ceased, and Sophia and I were left alone processing a trauma we never truly processed because we were taught to view it not as an avoidable tragedy, but as a glorious testimony to Vincent's faith. Years later, when I finally allowed critical thoughts about that decision into my mind, I realized my husband did not die for God, he died for an interpretation of obscure biblical scriptures about blood that a religious organization turned into absolute doctrine, condemning thousands of people to unnecessary death over the decades. But in 2004, standing beside his coffin at the funeral, all I could feel was pride for his faithfulness, mixed with an overwhelming sadness that I was not permitted to question. The years after Vincent's death were a blur of work, intensified congregational activity, and emotional denial. I took a second job as a clerk in a pharmacy to supplement the small pension Vincent left, maintained my pioneering despite the exhaustion, and focused all my energy on ensuring Sophia remained spiritually strong. She was baptized at 18, more out of pressure and expectation than genuine conviction, something I clearly realize now but was invisible to me at the time. I started serving more in the congregation, helping clean the hall, organizing social events, visiting elderly sisters who were sick or alone. I kept myself so busy that I didn't have time to think deeply about anything, which in retrospect I realize was exactly the goal, to keep witnesses so occupied with organizational activities that there is no mental energy left to question. Sophia moved out at 22, something that was painful but which I tried to view as natural. She got a job as a manager in a clothing store, lived with 2 other young sisters from the congregation, still attended meetings regularly, still went out preaching occasionally. But I could see something changing in her, a distance growing between her and the organization that she never verbalized but was there in her eyes every time we had conversations about spiritual goals or seeking privileges. In 2012, she met a young man at work who was not a witness, started dating him despite all the warnings about not getting unequally yoked, and eventually told me she was marrying him, regardless of what I or the organization thought about it. It was devastating for me, not because she was getting married, but because it meant she was choosing a life outside the truth, that all the effort Vincent and I put into raising her spiritually had failed. Her wedding took place in a small civil ceremony that the elders advised me not to attend if I wanted to make my stand clear about her incorrect decision. I went anyway, because she was my daughter and I couldn't imagine not being there, but I sat in the back of the court wedding room with tears streaming down my face, feeling like I was watching her throw away her salvation. Over the following years, our relationship became strained, punctuated by brief conversations where I tried to bring her back to the truth and she politely but firmly changed the subject. Eventually, she stopped attending meetings completely, although she never formally disassociated, which meant I technically could still talk to her, although the elders made it clear that limiting contact would be the spiritually wiser course of action. It was in 2017 that the cracks in my own faith began to deepen in ways I could no longer ignore. The organization had recently introduced the JW broadcasting streaming system, and I religiously watched all the monthly governing body programs, seeing those men speak directly to the camera about various doctrinal and organizational matters. There was something about the videos that bothered me in a way I couldn't fully articulate. Perhaps it was the overly polished production. Perhaps it was the expressions of absolute certainty about biblical interpretations that had changed multiple times over the decades. Perhaps it was the way they spoke about money and donations with a frequency that seemed disproportionate for an organization that claimed not to worry about material things. I started paying more attention during meetings and assemblies to things I previously let slide, the amount of time spent talking about obedience to the organization versus time spent talking about Jesus Christ, the frequency with which brothers were advised to do more when they were already doing everything they could, the way any criticism or questioning was immediately labeled as apostate thinking. A specific incident at a regional assembly in July 2018 hit me particularly hard. One of the speakers was giving a talk on loyalty to Jehovah, and he told a story about a mother who had completely disfellowshipped her adult daughter who had left the truth, refusing even to answer her phone calls or reply to messages. The speaker presented this as a wonderful example of faith, saying that this mother was putting Jehovah first even when it hurt deeply. I looked around the auditorium and saw thousands of witnesses applauding, and something inside me revolted. I thought of Sophia, I thought of the possibility of cutting her completely out of my life, and for the first time in decades, I allowed myself to think that maybe, just maybe, there was something profoundly wrong with a God who would demand that of a mother. I obviously didn't vocalize these thoughts to anyone, but they were there, planted in my mind, starting to germinate in ways I couldn't reverse. The decisive moment came completely unexpectedly in February 2020. The congregation was doing a deep cleaning of the Kingdom Hall, preparing for a visit from the circuit overseer, and I was in the elder's office helping organize old files that had accumulated over years. In the back of a dusty filing cabinet, I found a cardboard box full of old letters, memos, and congregational documents dating back to the 80s and 90s. I started leafing through out of curiosity, and that's when I found a folder marked confidential containing correspondence between the elders of our congregation and the branch office about cases of child sexual abuse that had occurred over the years. It wasn't just one case, it wasn't just Julia whose story I already knew. There were 7 different cases, spread over a 20-year period, involving 5 different abusers, some of whom had served as elders or ministerial servants during or after the accusations. In every case, the pattern was exactly the same: the victim or their family reported the abuse to the elders followed the 2-witness rule policy, failed to find a second witness because sexual abuse obviously doesn't happen in front of an audience, and then archived the case without ever reporting to secular authorities. There were letters from the branch office specifically instructing elders not to report cases to the police unless they were legally obliged to do so, citing concerns about protecting the organization's reputation and invoking ecclesiastical confession privilege. There were internal memos discussing strategies for dealing with families who were threatening to sue or go to the media, including suggestions to move them to other congregations or discourage them from causing a scandal that could bring reproach upon Jehovah's name. I sat on the floor of that office, holding those papers with trembling hands, feeling like the ground was literally collapsing beneath me. This was not a failure of a few bad elders in an isolated congregation. This was a systematic, documented policy, approved by the highest ranks of the organization. Children had been abused, their families had begged for help, and the response of the organization that claimed to be God's only channel on earth was to protect the abusers and silence the victims in the name of avoiding scandal. I thought of all the times I defended the organization against accusations that they covered up abuse, all the times I said they were just lying apostates trying to defame the truth, all the times I refused even to consider that there might be something structurally wrong with the organizational policies. I took photos of all the documents with my phone, instinctively knowing that if anyone discovered what I had found, those papers would disappear immediately. I put everything back exactly as it was, finished cleaning the office as if nothing had happened, and went home in a state of shock. I spent the whole night awake, reading the documents repeatedly on my phone, each reading solidifying the terrible reality of what I had discovered. For the first time in almost 40 years, I allowed myself to search for information outside the organization, breaking the golden rule of never looking at apostate material. I searched online about Jehovah's Witnesses' child abuse policies and discovered that what I had found in Portland was not unique. There were thousands of documented cases around the world, lawsuits in multiple countries, government investigations in Australia and the United Kingdom that exposed the exact same pattern of systematic cover-up. The most devastating was discovering that the Australian Royal Commission had found that the organisation had files on over 1,000 child abusers in its Australian congregations alone, and in none of those cases had the elders reported the abuses to the police. I watched hours of video testimony of governing body members being interrogated under oath, watching them evade questions, claim not to remember crucial details, defend the two-witness rule policy even when confronted with the obvious fact that it protected pedophiles. I saw testimonies from adult victims who had been abused as children in the organization, describing the double trauma of being abused and then silenced by the structure that should have protected them. Every video, every document, every testimony was another nail in the coffin of my faith, and while it was agonizing, it was also strangely liberating to finally understand that my instincts, those moments of discomfort I had pushed down for decades, were completely correct. The following week was the hardest of my life. I continued going to meetings, continued going out preaching, continued smiling and greeting brothers and sisters, all while feeling like I was living in a parallel reality where no one else knew what I knew. I tried to talk to a close sister with whom I had pioneered for years, cautiously mentioning that I had read some disturbing things about abuse policies in the organization, and her reaction was immediate and alarming. She sternly warned me about looking at apostate material, reminded me that Satan would use any tactic to turn us away from the truth, and suggested I talk to the elders if I was having doubts. I realized at that moment that there was no safe way to have these conversations inside the organization, that the system was built specifically to silence dissenting voices before they could infect others with questioning. 3 weeks after finding those documents, a woman I had never seen before appeared at my door. She was about 60, white-haired, eyes red from crying, and asked if she could speak with me about something important. I invited her in, and she told me that her 9-year-old granddaughter had recently revealed that a brother in the congregation, not mine, but one across the city, had abused her over a period of months when the family visited regularly for Bible studies. The family had reported to the elders of that congregation, and the response was exactly what I now knew to expect: requests for the two-witness rule, invasive meetings interrogating the child, and finally no action taken against the abuser. This grandmother was going door to door talking to longtime witnesses from various congregations, desperately trying to find someone who would believe her, someone who would help her, someone who would admit that there was something profoundly wrong with how these situations were handled. And there I was, sitting in my living room, finally having to decide whether to remain silent or to speak up. It was at that moment, sitting with that heartbroken grandmother in my living room, that I made the decision that would change my life completely. I showed her the photos of the documents I had found, confirmed that her worst suspicions about the organization systematically protecting abusers were absolutely true, and said that I would do everything in my power to help her expose what was happening. In the following weeks, we reported her granddaughter's case to the police, contacted lawyers specializing in institutional abuse cases, and I began speaking openly with anyone who would listen about what I had discovered. The organization's response was swift and brutal. I was summoned for a judicial committee hearing on apostasy, accused of spreading slanderous lies about Jehovah's organization and causing divisions, and disfellowshipped in March 2020, exactly 1 month after finding those documents. Overnight, I lost my entire social network of 40 years. Sisters I had served with for decades crossed the street when they saw me coming. People I had helped in their darkest moments treated me as if I were invisible. And most painfully, Sophia was initially furious with me for causing a scandal and bringing shame to our family, refusing to speak to me for weeks after the announcement of my disfellowshipping. But as I began to share with her what I had discovered, as she began to do her own research and process her own experience growing up in the organization, something shifted. 3 months after my disfellowshipping, she called me crying and apologized for all the years she had secretly blamed me for her father's death, for all the pressure she felt to be something she never was, for all the parts of herself she had suppressed to fit a mold the organization demanded. Today, at 63, I have a closer and more honest relationship with my daughter than I have had in her entire life. I lost my community, but I gained my integrity. I lost my comfortable certainty, but I gained the ability to think critically and live authentically. I still process the trauma of discovering that I dedicated 42 years of my life to an organization that puts its own reputation above the safety of children, but I am finally free to do that processing without having to defend the indefensible. The secret I discovered cost me everything, but it also gave me something priceless: the real truth, not the controlled version I was fed for decades. And if you have reached the end of this story, if something here resonated with your own experience or sparked questions you are afraid to ask, know that you are not alone, that questioning is not spiritual weakness, and that the true truth never needs to be protected by threats of ostracism or fear. It simply is, waiting patiently to be discovered by anyone brave enough to look.